The massive space station of Zenith Prime hung like a giant metallic jewel against the endless black of space. Its gleaming corridors stretched for kilometers, housing the most prestigious interstellar academy in the known galaxy. Thousands of young aliens from hundreds of different species called this place home, learning, competing, and preparing for their future roles in the vast cosmic society. Lyra Thax stood out, and not in a good way. Her mixed heritage was painfully obvious to everyone around her. Her skin shimmered with an unusual iridescent quality, part scaled like the Chloraxians, part smooth like the Vordians, with subtle bone ridges that hinted at her complicated genetic background. Other students whispered and pointed whenever she passed, their translator devices barely concealing their cruel comments. "Look at her," Zark, a tall Syrian student with razor-sharp bone spikes protruding from his shoulders, muttered loudly. "Another genetic mistake." His friends laughed, their multiple eyes blinking in synchronized mockery. Lyra tried to ignore them. She had become an expert at making herself invisible, keeping her gaze fixed on the holographic displays in the learning chambers, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Her data pad trembled slightly in her hands, a small betrayal of the emotions she fought hard to control. In the advanced xenobiology class, Professor Krelnax deliberately ignored her raised hand. When she finally mustered the courage to ask a question, he turned away, pretending not to hear. The other students snickered, a sound that cut through her like 1,000 tiny blades. During the midday nutrition period, Lyra sat alone in the massive circular dining hall. Hundreds of alien species filled the space with a cacophony of sounds, languages, and strange eating rituals. Floating platforms carried meals for those who couldn't breathe standard atmosphere. Tentacled beings consumed liquid nutrients. Crystalline life forms absorbed energy through specialized membranes. And in the middle of it all, Lyra sat with her simple nutrition pack, looking smaller and more isolated than ever. 2 Chloraxian students accidentally bumped her table, sending her meal pack crashing to the floor. "Oops," one of them said without a hint of apology, his multiple mandibles clicking with amusement. Lyra scrambled to clean up the mess, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Her mother, Silex Kathax, was a respected xenobiological researcher who rarely spent time at the academy. She would send occasional encrypted messages, filled more with scientific data than motherly warmth. "Adapt and survive," was her constant advice. Easy for her to say, Lyra thought, when she wasn't the one facing daily torment. The bullying wasn't just verbal. During physical training sessions, Lyra was always the last to be selected for team exercises. When she was finally assigned to a team, she was given the most menial tasks, carrying equipment, setting up training zones, never actually participating in the main activities. Her academic records were impressive. Top marks in theoretical sciences, advanced mathematical modeling, and sinological communication systems. But in the cutthroat environment of Zenith Prime, academic excellence meant little without social support or physical prowess. What her tormentors didn't know was that Lyra was more than she appeared. Beneath her quiet exterior and seemingly fragile appearance, something extraordinary was waiting, a genetic inheritance that would soon change everything they thought they knew about her. For now, she endured. She watched, she learned, and she waited. The combat simulation room was a nightmare Lyra had grown to dread. Today was no different. 15 alien students formed a tight circle around her, their eyes filled with a mixture of disgust and anticipation. They expected her to fail. They always did. "Pair up," bellowed Instructor Krull, a massive Vordian with skin like polished metal and eyes that could freeze a student in place. The other students quickly grouped together, leaving Lyra standing alone. At the last moment, a reluctant Chloraxian named Mex was pushed towards her, forced to be her training partner. Mex sneered. "Try not to embarrass yourself too much," he muttered, his multiple mandibles clicking with contempt. The simulation began. A holographic battlefield materialized around them. A complex terrain of rocky outcroppings, narrow valleys, and strategic high ground. Their task was simple: navigate the terrain, locate and neutralize enemy targets, and protect their team's base. Most students would use standard tactical approaches they had learned in countless training sessions. But something was different today. As the simulation progressed, Lyra found herself moving with a precision she had never experienced before. Her movements were calculated, almost instinctive. Where she would normally freeze or make a mistake, she now saw pathways and solutions. Mechs watched in growing disbelief as Lyra began to outmaneuver the holographic enemies with impossible efficiency. Her hands moved across the tactical interface with surprising speed. She anticipated enemy movements before they happened, redirecting Mech's actions with short, crisp commands that cut through his initial resistance. What started as mockery turned into a grudging respect as their team began to dominate the simulation. Instructor Krell noticed first. His metallic eyebrows raised slightly, a rare sign of surprise for the normally impassive trainer. He zoomed in on Lyra's tactical display, watching her unexpected strategic decisions. "Impossible," he mumbled, just loud enough for the nearby monitoring system to catch. In the final moments of the simulation, Lyra executed a complex maneuver that should have been beyond her skill level. She used the terrain, predicted enemy movements, and orchestrated a victory that left the entire class stunned. Mech stood speechless, his earlier contempt completely dissolved. As the holographic battlefield faded, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Lyra looked down at her hands, surprised by her own performance. She hadn't done this before. How had she known exactly what to do? Commander Relax, who had been observing the training session from a hidden monitoring room, leaned forward. His three-lens eye system zoomed in on Lyra's genetic profile, which was displayed on a secondary screen. Something was different. Something was unusual. The other students whispered. Some looked impressed. Others looked confused. A few still seemed ready to mock her, but their confidence was shaken. Lyra Thax was no longer just the weak, bullied mixed-breed student. "Debrief in 5 minutes," Instructor Krell announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Especially you, Kathax." Lyra's heart raced. She knew something had changed. The way she moved, the way she thought during the simulation. It was unlike anything she had experienced before. Her mother's cryptic messages about adaptation suddenly seemed less like distant advice and more like a warning. Something was stirring deep within her genetic makeup, something powerful, something unexpected. And this was just the beginning. Commander Relax's private office was a sealed chamber of technological wonder. Holographic screens flickered with classified data, and advanced security systems hummed softly in the background. He was not a typical administrator, even among the varied species of Zenith Prime. Relax stood out as someone who knew more than he ever revealed. His three-lens eye system carefully examined the encrypted genetic file of Lyra Thax. Each lens focused on a different aspect of her complex genetic structure, zooming in and out with microscopic precision. Something was wrong. Something was extraordinary. The initial genetic scan had raised red flags, but this deeper analysis was sending shockwaves through his understanding of biological science. Lyra's genetic makeup contained markers that simply should not exist. Adaptive sequences, problem-solving DNA structures, survival algorithms embedded directly into her cellular structure. And then he found it, a genetic signature that was both familiar and impossible. With a careful touch, he activated a secure communication channel. The encryption was so complex that only 3 beings in the entire galaxy could potentially decrypt it. A small holographic interface appeared, showing nothing but a blinking cursor. "Verify. Relax. Secondary Research Division, Zenith Prime," he spoke clearly. The cursor blinked 3 times, then a single word appeared. Co-and-fire, M2. Access file. Kfax, Lyra. Genetic Origin Protocol, Relax commanded. The holographic screens erupted with a cascade of information. Classified documents, sealed research reports, mission logs from decades ago. And at the center of it all, a name that made Commander Relax's breath catch in his throat. Human. Humans were supposed to be a myth, a legend, a species that had supposedly disappeared centuries ago after a massive interstellar conflict. Some said they had been wiped out. Others claimed they had simply vanished. But the genetic evidence was irrefutable. Lyra's father was human. The mission logs told a fragmented story, a deep space exploration team, a classified mission that went beyond standard galactic exploration, genetic modification experiments, survival protocols, and one name that kept appearing. Dr. James Holloway, a human specialist whose reputation was both legendary and terrifying. Relax cross-referenced the data. Dr. Holloway had been part of an experimental program designed to create the ultimate adaptive species, a human who could survive anywhere, think beyond traditional limitations, solve problems that seemed impossible. And somehow he had a daughter. Selex Kthax, Lyra's mother, was a renowned xenobiological researcher. Her work had always seemed unusual, experimental. Now it made perfect sense. She hadn't just randomly selected a human partner. This was deliberate. A genetic experiment. A child designed to be something more than any known species. The combat simulation suddenly made sense. Lyra's unexpected skills, her ability to adapt and overcome. It wasn't luck. It was genetic engineering at its most advanced level. Commander Relax leaned back in his chair. The implications were massive. If word got out that a human hybrid existed, it would change everything. The galactic political structure, scientific understanding, the very concept of what was possible. He had a choice to make: reveal the truth, or protect the most important genetic discovery in centuries. The blinking cursor waited, decision pending. The genetic research lab was a sterile environment of white walls and humming machines. Dr. Area Excel, the most respected xenogenetic analyst in the galaxy, stared at the holographic DNA strand rotating before her eyes. Her four-fingered hands moved carefully, manipulating the three-dimensional genetic map with practiced precision. "This is impossible," she muttered, not for the first time. The genetic sample belonged to Lyra Kthax, but it was unlike anything Dr. Excel had ever seen before. Human DNA was supposed to be a myth, a barely remembered genetic footnote in galactic history. Yet here it was, intertwined with alien genetic structures in a way that defied every known biological principle. Each strand told a story of impossible adaptation. Most species had genetic structures that were relatively stable. They evolved slowly. They had predictable mutation patterns. But this sample, it was alive, dynamic, constantly rewriting its own rules. Dr. Excel isolated specific genetic markers. One sequence showed an ability to rapidly adapt to environmental changes. Another demonstrated unprecedented problem-solving capabilities encoded directly into cellular memory. Some sections looked like they could literally redesign themselves in response to external challenges. The human genetic component was like a master key. It could unlock potential that other species could only dream about. She pulled up historical records. Humans had been known for something called lateral thinking, the ability to solve problems by approaching them from unexpected angles. But this was beyond anything in the old archives. This was genetic lateral thinking, problem-solving written into the very fabric of existence. Comparative analysis began. The lab's most powerful quantum computers worked overtime, comparing Lyra's genetic structure to every known species in the galactic database. Cloraxian adaptive capabilities, enhanced. Vortian regenerative potential, multiplied. Syrian strategic thinking, restructured and improved. It was as if human DNA was the ultimate genetic Swiss Army knife. Adaptable, flexible, capable of integrating and improving upon any genetic structure it encountered. Dr. Excel's secondary analysis revealed something even more shocking. The genetic modifications weren't just random. They were deliberate, precisely engineered. Someone, or something, had designed this genetic structure with incredible care and purpose. Her communication device blinked. A message from Commander Relax. Encrypted. Urgent. Confirm your findings. Is the subject unique? Dr. Excel's fingers flew across the holographic interface. Her response was careful but clear. Not just unique, potentially the most significant genetic discovery in galactic history. The implications were staggering. A single hybrid could potentially possess abilities that entire species had spent millions of years evolving. Adaptive capabilities that could revolutionize understanding of genetics, survival, and biological potential. What had started as a simple genetic experiment now looked like something much larger. A blueprint, a prototype, perhaps even the first step in something humanity had been planning long before their apparent disappearance. Dr. Excel zoomed out on the genetic map. The DNA strands looked almost like a complex circuit. Interconnected, purposeful, waiting. Not just a genetic sample, a weapon, a solution, a new beginning. Only time would tell. The Zenith Prime Annual Challenge was the most important event of the academic year. Every species sent their top students to compete in a multi-day trial that tested physical ability, strategic thinking, survival skills, and technological adaptation. Entire planetary reputations hung in the balance. Lyra Kthax stood at the edge of the massive preparation area. Around her, students from dozens of different species prepared their equipment. Chlorrexian teams checked their exoskeleton protective gear. Vortian groups calibrated advanced sensory equipment. Syrian squads performed synchronized warm-up routines. And then there was Lyra. Alone. Overlooked. Most teams had 4 to 6 members. Lyra had been assigned to a makeshift group of misfits, students who couldn't find placement elsewhere. They looked at her with a mixture of resignation and mild contempt. The team leader, a large Krenak named Zorn, barely acknowledged her existence. "Listen up," Zorn growled during their pre-challenge briefing. "Just try not to slow us down." The challenge arena was a marvel of technological engineering. A massive enclosed environment that could simulate multiple planetary conditions. Extreme heat, freezing cold, toxic atmospheres, minimal resources. Each team would be dropped into a random environment and forced to survive, complete objectives, and outperform competing teams. As the countdown began, Lyra felt something stirring inside her. The same feeling she had experienced during the combat simulation. A sense of potential, of something waiting to be unleashed. The first challenge dropped them into a volcanic landscape. Toxic gases swirled. Temperatures fluctuated between extreme heat and sudden, freezing cold. Most teams struggled immediately. Equipment failed. Communication systems went offline. Survival became a moment-to-moment challenge. But something was different about Lyra's team. Where other teams panicked, Lyra began to analyze. Her movements became precise, calculated. She noticed details that others missed. A small rock formation that could provide shelter. A subtle wind pattern that suggested a safer pathway. Minute environmental clues that others completely overlooked. Zorn watched in growing amazement as Lyra began to guide their team. Her suggestions were not just good. They were perfect. Each decision improved their chances of survival by seemingly impossible margins. Their communication system had failed, but Lyra developed a complex hand signal system on the spot, allowing them to communicate silently and effectively. When their primary survival gear malfunctioned, she quickly modified secondary equipment to compensate. Other teams began to notice. Whispers spread through the challenge monitoring systems. Who was this mixed-breed student who seemed to be doing the impossible? By the second day, Lyra's team wasn't just surviving. They were thriving. Where other groups struggled, they moved with an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. Zorn, who had initially dismissed Lyra, now looked at her with something close to respect. Commander Relax and Dr. Excel watched the live feed, their eyes locked on Lyra's performance. The genetic analysis made sense now. This was no accident. This was deliberate. This was purpose. As the challenge entered its final stages, Lyra's team had become the team to beat. The bullied outcast was now the most watched competitor in the entire challenge. Something extraordinary was happening, and nobody knew exactly what. The classified archives were not meant to be opened. Layers of quantum encryption protected the files, each security measure more complex than the last. But Commander Relax had clearance levels that went beyond standard protocols. Dr. James Holloway's file materialized as a holographic projection. A man with piercing blue eyes and a look of intense concentration stared back from the image. The file was a puzzle, fragmented, partially deleted, but still holding incredible secrets. Holloway had not been a typical scientist. His records showed impossible achievements, adaptation studies that defied current scientific understanding, genetic research that seemed more like science fiction than established fact. The earliest entries painted a picture of a brilliant but controversial researcher. Humans, according to the historical notes, had been facing extinction. Their home planet damaged beyond repair, their species scattered across distant star systems. Holloway's mission was simple yet impossible: ensure human survival by creating the ultimate adaptive genetic template. Mission logs revealed extraordinary details. Holloway had studied dozens of alien species, mapping their genetic structures. But he wasn't looking to copy. He was looking to improve, to create something that could survive anywhere, a genetic blueprint that could adapt to any environment, solve any problem. One encrypted entry caught Relax's attention, a personal log, barely readable. Adaptation is not just about survival. It's about potential. Every challenge is an opportunity. Every limitation is a problem waiting to be solved. Silex Cathax entered the story unexpectedly, a xenobiological researcher who had been studying genetic compatibility across species. She wasn't just a researcher. She was a partner in Holloway's most ambitious project. Their daughter would be a living experiment, a genetic marvel designed to demonstrate the ultimate potential of adaptive intelligence. The mission files showed multiple failed attempts, hundreds of genetic combinations, countless experiments. But Lyra was different. She was successful. She was alive. More disturbing details emerged. Holloway knew he might not survive to see his ultimate creation. The mission was dangerous, experimental, operating at the very edge of scientific understanding. His last recorded message was a cryptic warning. The true potential is not in the genes. It's in the ability to learn, to adapt, to become more than what you are currently designed to be. Relax zoomed in on a partially deleted image. A laboratory, complex genetic equipment, and in the background, a small device, something that looked like a message capsule, designed to be activated only under specific circumstances. Another layer of the mystery unfolded. Holloway had not just created a child. He had created a message, a living message. Lyra was more than a genetic experiment. She was a carrier, a potential key to something much larger. The final line of the file was the most intriguing, partially encrypted but still readable. Piroto Keiko Omije. Initiated, awaiting activation. What did it mean? What was Protocol Omega? Commander Relax realized he was holding his breath. The story of Lyra Thax was far from complete. In fact, it seemed like it was just beginning. Something was coming, and Lyra was at the center of it all. The final simulation was nothing like anyone had expected. A massive holographic environment materialized, a complex, ever-changing landscape that defied normal physical laws. Multiple planetary conditions merged and shifted. Atmospheric pressure fluctuated. Gravity became unpredictable. This was the ultimate test of adaptive capabilities. Lyra stood at the center of the chaos. Around her, the best students from every known species struggled. Cloraxian teams broke down as their exoskeletons failed to adapt. Vordian strategic units collapsed under the constant environmental shifts. Syrian problem solvers found their advanced computational systems overwhelmed. But Lyra remained calm. Something inside her was awakening. The genetic inheritance from her father was no longer a hidden potential. It was becoming a living, breathing reality. Where others saw impossible challenges, she saw patterns. Solutions that didn't exist to anyone else were crystal clear to her. Her mind worked differently, not just faster, not just smarter, but fundamentally unique. The simulation threw impossible scenarios at the competitors. Toxic environments that changed composition every few seconds. Gravitational fields that twisted and warped. Communication systems that collapsed and rebuilt themselves randomly. Each challenge was designed to break even the most adaptable species. Lyra began to move. Her movements were unlike anything the observers had ever seen. She didn't just react to the changing environment. She anticipated it, predicted it. Her body and mind worked as a single, perfect adaptive system. When a section of the environment turned toxic, she was already creating a filtration method. As gravity shifted, she found balance points that shouldn't have been possible. Communication systems failed. She developed new communication protocols in seconds. Commander Relax and Dr. Excel watched in absolute amazement. "This is beyond genetic modification," Dr. Excel whispered. "This is evolution in real time." The other students watched Lyra with a mixture of fear and wonder. The girl they had bullied, the mixed-breed outcast, was now performing miracles. She wasn't just surviving the impossible simulation. She was mastering it. Zorn, her former team leader, stood slack-jawed. The same student who had once told her to try not to slow the team down now watched her rewrite the very understanding of survival. As the simulation entered its final stages, Lyra's performance became legendary. She didn't just complete the objectives. She reimagined them. Solved problems that hadn't even been part of the original challenge. A holographic display tracked her progress. Performance metrics that had never been seen before. Adaptation rates that defied current scientific understanding. Problem-solving capabilities that looked more like magic than science. The simulation's AI began to adjust, making the challenge harder, more complex, trying to find her limits. But Lyra had no limits. Her genetic inheritance from her human father was more than just an advantage. It was a complete reimagining of what was possible. She wasn't just adapting. She was evolving in real time, becoming something entirely new. As the final moments of the simulation approached, Lyra stood at the center of a world that had been completely transformed, not by the simulation's design, but by her own incredible potential. The bullied outcast had become something extraordinary. And this was just the beginning. The Zenith Prime Council chamber fell silent when Lyra Kthax walked in. Gone was the bullied, quiet girl. In her place stood a being that defied every known classification. 15 of the most powerful leaders from different galactic species sat around a circular platform. Their eyes, some organic, some technological, some completely alien, focused on her with a mixture of fear, respect, and pure curiosity. Commander Relax stepped forward. His 3-lens eye system zoomed in, analyzing every micro-movement. "Lyra Kthax," he announced, "you have become something unprecedented. A living example of genetic potential that challenges everything we understand about evolution, adaptation, and survival." The genetic reports were displayed on massive holographic screens. Each screen showed a different aspect of her incredible capabilities. Adaptive responses that rewrote biological understanding. Problem-solving abilities that looked more like advanced artificial intelligence than natural genetic potential. The Cloraxian representative spoke first. His multiple mandibles clicked with a sound that was part speech, part nervous reaction. "How is this possible?" Dr. Excel, standing beside Lyra, presented the findings. "She is the result of a decades-old project, a human genetic experiment designed to create the ultimate adaptive species. Her father, Dr. James Holloway, created a genetic blueprint that could survive and thrive in any environment." Whispers filled the chamber. Humans were supposed to be extinct. A myth. A species that had vanished centuries ago. Yet here was living proof of their incredible potential. The Vordian lead scientist leaned forward. "Protocol Omega," he muttered, remembering the encrypted files. It was real. Lyra stood perfectly still, but something was happening. Her genetic structure was actively responding to the environment. Micro-adaptations happening faster than any scanning system could properly track. She wasn't just a person. She was a living, breathing evolution machine. "I have a message." Lyra spoke. Her voice was different, calm, precise. "From my father." A small device materialized from a hidden pocket. It projected a holographic message, the final communication from Dr. James Holloway. "To whoever receives this," the hologram began, "humanity's greatest strength was never our technology. It was our ability to adapt, to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. Lyra is not just my daughter. She is a message, a potential, a beginning." The council members exchanged looks. This was more than a scientific discovery. This was a potential reset of galactic understanding. The Syrian diplomatic leader asked the question everyone was thinking. "What happens now?" Lyra's response was unexpected. "Now we solve problems. Now we show what's possible." Her genetic potential wasn't just about survival. It was about progress, about finding solutions that no single species could imagine. She represented something entirely new, a bridge between species, a living demonstration of what could be achieved through true adaptation. Commander Relax realized they were witnessing something historic. The girl who had been bullied, overlooked, and marginalized was now the most important being in the galaxy. A new chapter was beginning, and Lyra Thax was writing it. The hybrid, the outcast, the potential savior of galactic civilization.